He bought a destroyed ranch after the hurricane, a place where, according to the locals, not even grass grows anymore. Everyone laughed at him and called him crazy, but when he stepped into the collapsed barn and saw what was still alive inside, he was stunned. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The road that wound through the forgotten countryside seemed to stretch endlessly, a ribbon of cracked asphalt breaking apart under weeds in the stubborn grip of time. Michael Henderson gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup, its paint long faded and the dashboard layered with dust. The air smelled of dry heat and salt blown inland from the coast, a ghostly reminder of the storm that had long ago driven life from this place. 30 years had passed since the hurricane named Gloria had torn through the region, leveling homes, barns, and the quiet dreams of people who once believed the earth would always answer their labor with kindness. He had been a young man then, 20 years old and strong, standing beside his father as the sky split open and the world turned to chaos. The memory had never left him. The roar of the wind like a freight train, the metallic scream of nails being ripped from wood, the impossible sound of rain slamming against walls until the walls themselves gave way. That night had changed everything. Now, decades later, he was coming back to land very much like the one he had lost. He had buried his parents years ago, and the city had offered nothing but work that broke the body and dulled the mind. He had tried to build a life in narrow apartments and crowded neighborhoods, surrounded by concrete and strangers, but the soil had always called to him in his sleep. The dream never faded, the smell of hay, the rough texture of old fences, the rhythm of morning chores when the world was still soft and unhurried. He knew he was chasing something half-remembered, half-imagined. But after losing his wife and the last traces of purpose that kept him in the city, the dream no longer seemed foolish. It felt necessary. When he told people in town what he planned to do, they laughed outright. "You're buying that place?" one man said at the feed store, shaking his head. "You'd be better off burying your money out there. Ain't nothing left but ghosts and snakes." Even the real estate clerk, a thin woman with tobacco-stained fingers, looked at him as though she were selling him a gravestone. The property had been listed for years, its price dropping again and again until it was worth less than a used car. But to Michael, the low cost wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that no one wanted it, and that meant he could finally have a piece of land that would be entirely his. He signed the papers with the quiet determination of a man who had already decided there was no turning back. The old woman handed him a single key, rusty and bent, with a faint smile that carried no belief in his endeavor. He thanked her, loaded the truck with what little he owned, tools, canned food, 2 blankets, a battered Bible that had belonged to his mother, and drove east until the city disappeared in the rearview mirror. The road grew narrower, the fields emptier. Houses turned into skeletons of their former selves. Porches collapsed, barns sunken into the earth. Telephone poles leaned drunkenly, wires dangling like vines. By the time he reached the edge of his newly bought land, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky with bands of gold and violet. The gate was half buried in sand, the hinges corroded, the wooden posts blackened by years of storms and sun. He stopped the truck and stepped out, his boots crunching against gravel. The silence was immense, so total it made his heartbeat seem too loud. The farmhouse loomed ahead, or what remained of it. The roof had caved in at one end, and ivy crept through the empty window frames like fingers reclaiming a corpse. The barn beside it was little more than a leaning box of timber. The fences had fallen, the fields had turned to scrub and thorn, Still, there was something about it that stirred him. Perhaps it was the smell of the air. Dry, yes, but faintly sweet, as if the soil was remembering what it used to be. He walked toward the house, the boards of the porch groaning under his weight. Inside, the rooms were stripped bare. The walls were streaked with water stains, the floors warped and cracked. Dust lay thick as frost. A broken chair sat in the corner, a relic from whoever had last believed this land could still be home. He ran his hand along the wall and felt the splinters catch his skin. That night, he didn't dare sleep inside. He set up camp in the bed of his truck, lighting a single kerosene lamp that cast a trembling glow on the ruins around him. The wind picked up as darkness deepened, carrying with it the low whistle of something ancient. At times he thought he heard movement in the distance, a faint scuffle, the creak of something shifting, but when he looked there was nothing. Only the wind, brushing through the dry grass like a whisper too soft to understand. He wrapped his coat around him and leaned back, watching the stars push through the black sky. Out here, the heavens looked sharper, more deliberate, as if the world had been stripped down to its bones. He thought of his father, of the calloused hands that had once guided his own on the handle of a plow. The land gives what you give it, his father used to say, no more, no less. Those words had seemed simple once. Now they carried a weight he could hardly bear. He had nothing left to give but himself. No family, no fortune, no reputation, just labor and stubbornness. Maybe that would be enough. As the night stretched on, a faint sound drifted through the air, a soft bleating, distant yet distinct. He froze. Then came another noise, a shuffle of hooves against the earth, followed by what sounded like a low grunt. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things, the echo of old memories coming back to taunt him. But the sounds persisted. Something alive was moving out there. He sat up slowly, peering toward the silhouette of the barn. The darkness there seemed deeper than the rest, layered with motion he couldn't quite define. He told himself it was impossible. The property had been abandoned for decades. No one could have kept animals alive here. The nearest neighbors were miles away, yet as he listened, the noises multiplied. A flutter of wings, the sharp cluck of what could only be a chicken, the sudden bray of something larger. He felt his pulse quicken. For a long moment, he sat in stillness, heart hammering, the lamp flickering beside him. Then, curiosity outweighing fear, he climbed from the truck and took a cautious step toward the sound. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wildflowers mixed with decay. The moon had risen, spilling a silver light over the broken fences and tall grass. As he neared the barn, he could see that one of its doors hung crooked, swinging slightly in the wind. He paused, listening. The noises inside had gone quiet, replaced by a heavy, rhythmic breathing. He laid a hand on the door and pushed gently. It groaned but yielded, opening just enough for him to slip through. The darkness inside was thick. Dust swirled in the pale shafts of moonlight that fell through the holes in the roof. At first, he saw only emptiness, broken beams, rusted tools, a tangle of old rope. But then, from the corner, came movement. Something small darted across the floor, feathers ruffling. A hen. Then another, perched high on a beam, eyes glinting. He took a step forward, scarcely believing what he saw. The barn was not empty. Near the far wall, a cluster of animals huddled together, a pair of goats, their coats dull but intact, a pig rooting weakly at the dirt, a dog lying beside a pile of hay, head lifted warily. There were others, too. A horse standing in the shadows, ribs visible but eyes alert, cats moving soundlessly along the rafters, a raccoon scurrying into a hole. The place that should have been silent was alive. Michael stood frozen, caught between awe and disbelief. These creatures had survived here, alone, through years of storms and hunger. Somehow, life had refused to surrender. He slowly crouched, letting his hands rest on his knees, not wanting to frighten them. The animals watched him in cautious silence, their breaths soft and steady. For a moment, no one moved. Then the horse shifted its weight, the dog's ears flicked, and the spell broke. The barn filled with sound, the shuffle of hooves, the whisper of feathers, the steady hum of existence. He felt something stir deep in his chest, an emotion too complex to name. It was not just wonder or pity, it was recognition. These animals, abandoned and forgotten, were survivors just like him. They had endured what others could not, clinging to this ruined place out of sheer will. In them, he saw a reflection of his own stubbornness. When he finally stepped back into the open air, the sky was paling with the first signs of dawn. He turned to look at the farmhouse again, its broken frame silhouetted against the rising light. The land looked desolate still, yet beneath the decay was something unmistakable, the pulse of life waiting to be tended. He felt it beneath his boots, in the air, in his own heartbeat. The silence no longer seemed empty, it was simply waiting to be filled. He walked back to the truck and sat on the tailgate, staring across the field as the sun lifted above the horizon. The wind stirred, carrying the faint sounds of the barn behind him, a soft cluck, a snort, a rustle. He smiled faintly, the first real smile in years. Everyone had told him this place was dead, that he was a fool for coming. But now he knew the truth. The land was not gone. It was sleeping, and it had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to wake it. Michael lifted his face toward the sun, the warmth spilling across his skin. His hands were calloused, his clothes already covered in dust, and the work ahead would likely break him. But he no longer cared. For the first time since the storm that had stolen his youth, he felt whole. The land no one wanted had chosen him, and in its quiet, battered way, it had given him a reason to begin again. He rose, turned toward the barn, and started walking. There was water to find, fences to mend, and hungry mouths waiting. The road that had brought him here was gone behind him, lost to dust and distance. Ahead lay only this, the ruin, the labor, and the fragile miracle of life that had somehow refused to die. And, for Michael Henderson, that was enough. When morning spread fully across the broken land, Michael Henderson stood beside the barn and stared at the world the sunlight had unveiled. The day before had been filled with disbelief. Now, in the clean light of dawn, what he saw filled him with something deeper and more haunting: responsibility. The storm-damaged fields, the leaning fences, the skeletal house all looked the same as when he'd arrived, yet they no longer seemed deserted. Every corner of the ranch held movement, breath, and the faint rustle of creatures that had claimed the ruins as their own. He could hear them even before he saw them, the low murmuring of pigeons high in the rafters, the rhythmic thump of hooves, the busy scratch of claws in the dirt. Life was everywhere, cautious but unyielding. He moved carefully through the yard, boots sinking into soft earth still wet from night dew. Near a collapsed fence, a flurry of wings startled him. A cluster of hens erupted into the air, scattering dust and feathers before settling again to peck at the ground. Their feathers were patchy, dull from years without care, but their eyes burned bright and sharp. A lone rooster, proud despite its ragged tail, strutted near them and let out a hoarse crow that echoed against the walls of the house. Michael smiled faintly. It was a sound he hadn't heard since childhood, and it seemed to cut through the silence like a promise that the world still remembered how to begin each day. Behind the barn, he discovered a shallow trough filled with muddy water, where a few ducks glided lazily, quacking in soft complaint as he approached. One, a drake with a broken wing that drooped unevenly, flapped awkwardly away from him but didn't flee. He crouched and watched them paddle in the murky pool, amazed that they had managed to carve out a home here. Their webbed feet stirred ripples that shimmered in the sun. Around the edges of the trough, frogs clung to damp earth, croaking as if to remind him that this was still their territory too. When he stepped into the shadow of the barn again, the smell of hay and animals was stronger. The first thing he noticed was movement along the wall, small, quick flashes of gray and white. Cats, at least a dozen of them, emerging from cracks and crevices like smoke. Their bodies were lean, their coats matted, but they moved with the effortless grace of creatures born to survive on scraps. One paused, fixing him with yellow eyes that held no fear, only a cautious curiosity. A pair of kittens tumbled after her, chasing each other across a fallen beam. The sight tugged at something inside him, a mix of sorrow and affection. These weren't pets, they were wild things shaped by hardship, but they had thrived here where people hadn't. In the farthest stall, half hidden by shadows, stood a horse. It was taller than he expected, a dark bay whose ribs showed like lines carved into leather. The animal's mane hung in tangled ropes, and one ear was notched from an old injury, yet, when it turned its head toward him, there was a dignity in its posture that froze him in place. The horse snorted, pawed once at the ground, and watched him steadily, as if weighing his worth. Michael took a slow step forward, murmuring softly without thinking. Nonsense words, the kind his father had once used around nervous animals. The horse flicked its tail but did not move away. Its eyes followed him, calm but alert. When he reached out a hand, it did not flinch. His fingers brushed coarse hair, warm and dry beneath the grime. For a moment, he stood there, palm against the creature's neck, feeling the faint tremor of breath. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that both had survived too much to be easily frightened anymore. The sound of hooves made him turn. Near the collapsed corral, two goats were butting each other playfully, their horns clacking. A smaller one, a kid barely grown, trotted between them, bleating. Beyond them, he saw a pair of sheep grazing on patches of stubborn grass. It amazed him that such animals could still find food here, among weeds and thistles, yet they seemed healthy enough, their wool thick and unshorn. A flash of movement at the edge of his vision made him glance toward a pile of debris, where a pig nosed through broken boards. Its pink hide was coated with mud, and beside it another smaller pig rooted energetically, grunting as if pleased with its discovery. Michael stood amid them all, overwhelmed. There were too many to count now, hens clucking, ducks quacking, goats bleating, cats weaving between shadows, dogs barking somewhere unseen. The barnyard had become a symphony of survival. It was impossible that they had endured without anyone to tend them. No fences, no feed, no protection. Yet here they were, an unlikely congregation bound together by instinct. He wondered how many generations had passed since people last lived here. These creatures must be descendants of animals left behind when the hurricane came, the ones that fled into the woods or clung to life in broken stalls. Somehow, through hunger and storm and heat, they had made their own kingdom out of ruin. From behind the old shed came a low growl, deep and warning. He turned quickly. Two dogs stood there, ribs visible beneath matted fur. One was large and black, its coat streaked with gray. The other, smaller, a reddish-brown mutt with wary eyes. Their ears were pricked, bodies tense, ready to defend what they saw as theirs. Michael froze, keeping his hands visible. He spoke gently, his voice low and even, not moving closer. The black dog's growl faded into silence, replaced by a hesitant whine. He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a piece of dried bread he had kept from breakfast. He tossed it toward them, not too near. The smaller one darted forward, snatched it up, and retreated, chewing noisily. The larger dog merely watched him, tail flicking once before it lowered its head and turned away. A truce, tentative but real. As he walked the property that morning, he kept discovering more signs of life. A family of raccoons had made their den in a hollow beneath the porch. Squirrels darted across the yard, carrying acorns salvaged from the single surviving oak tree. High above, pigeons cooed in the rafters of the barn, their feathers glinting silver in the light. A hawk circled far overhead, its shadow sweeping across the ground like a silent warning. Near the well, he startled a pair of wild rabbits that bounded away into the weeds. It felt less like he had found an abandoned ranch and more like he had stumbled upon a hidden sanctuary where nature had rewritten the rules of ownership. By midday, the sun burned hot, and Michael retreated into the shade of the porch, sitting on a step that creaked beneath his weight. From there, he could see nearly everything. The crooked barn door swaying in the breeze, the animals moving in loose rhythm, the grass bending and rising again under their passage. He drank from his canteen, the water warm but refreshing, and let his gaze wander over the land. It wasn't dead, it was simply untamed, waiting for someone to see it as it was rather than what it had been. The thought came to him quietly but firmly. He couldn't leave. He had come intending only to look, to satisfy a foolish curiosity before moving on. Yet the idea of walking away now felt impossible. These creatures had endured too much to be left alone again. He wasn't sure what he could do for them, but he knew he had to try. He would clean the well, find proper food, repair what he could. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But after everything he'd lost, after all the empty years spent searching for purpose, this living, breathing chaos felt like the first thing that truly mattered. As the afternoon waned, clouds drifted in from the horizon, soft and harmless for now. The air grew heavy with the scent of earth and hay. He watched the animals settling as the light shifted. Hens roosting in the low branches of a tree, goats lying down beside the fence, cats curling in a warm pile near the barn door. The dogs lay close to one another, still watchful but no longer hostile. Even the horse, that solemn sentinel of the ruin, lowered its head to graze, the last rays of sunlight catching its mane like strands of copper. Michael felt the weight of years lift slightly from his shoulders. He knew hardship was waiting just beyond the next sunrise. The struggle to find feed, to fix shelter before the rains, to protect the animals from whatever predators lurked in the woods. But as dusk settled and the sounds of the ranch blended into a steady hum of contented life, he allowed himself a rare moment of calm. He leaned back against the post, eyes half closed, listening to the slow rhythm of breathing that surrounded him. When darkness finally fell, he made his bed again in the truck, though now the silence felt different. It was no longer hollow. Beyond the cracked windows, he could hear the world alive with motion, the shuffle of hooves, the soft murmur of creatures settling for the night. He thought of what this place must have been before the storm, when people lived and worked here, when voices joined the sounds of animals. That life was gone, but something new had risen in its place, something raw and untamed yet filled with grace. Lying beneath the wide sky, he whispered a quiet promise to the darkness. He would not abandon them. He would give this land his labor, his time, whatever strength he had left. In return, perhaps it would give him belonging again. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. The kingdom he had found here was not dead. It was waiting, patient and alive, for someone to stand beside it. And now that he had seen it, he could never look away. The first true morning of work on the land began with the sound of wings. Michael woke to the flapping and rustling above the barn, the cackling of hens already quarreling over space on the rafters, and the muffled bleating of goats calling for feed. The sun was still low, thin streams of gold slipping through cracks in the walls of the farmhouse. He rose stiffly, stretching his arms as if shaking the sleep of years from his body, and stepped out into the yard where the light had just begun to break across the grass. The earth was cool beneath his boots, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the damp, heavy air that smelled of dust, hay, and animal life. The world around him felt awake. He looked towards the barn, its roof a ragged silhouette against the brightening sky. The sight of it stirred both pride and dread. It was a ruin, barely standing, yet within those walls life moved freely, life that had persisted against odds he could hardly comprehend. The memory of the previous day flooded back to him, the sight of animals appearing from the shadows one by one, each with the same wary intelligence in its eyes. They had lived without people for years, and now he was the intruder. But they had not driven him away, and that was enough. He had made them a silent promise as he fell asleep last night, and he meant to keep it. The first task came naturally. The animals needed water. The well behind the house was ancient, its stones coated in moss and its opening half filled with debris. He leaned over it now and saw only darkness, a faint glimmer of moisture deep below. When he pulled up the rope, the bucket that once hung there was long gone. He would need to make another or find one. Searching through the barn, he unearthed an old rusted pail half buried in hay and mud. The handle was bent and one side cracked, but it would do. He tied it to the rope, tested the knot, and lowered it slowly. The rope scraped against the stones with a hollow rasp, and when he finally heard the splash far below, a surge of relief filled him. He drew it up hand over hand, muscles burning. The water that surfaced was brown and smelled faintly of iron, but it was water all the same. He set the bucket down beside him and watched as the animals began to gather instinctively. The goats first, then the dogs, then a brave hen that hopped forward to peck at the damp ground. He filled a shallow pan and placed it near the doorway where the animals could reach it easily. Watching them drink, he felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. A quiet satisfaction, the simple reward of necessity met. The day stretched on in a rhythm he had almost forgotten, the kind of work that left no room for thought. He scavenged the property for tools, gathering whatever the storm and time had not swallowed. Beneath the collapsed roof of the shed, he found a hammer, a half-empty box of nails, and a saw so dull it could barely cut wood, but still managed to bite through soft boards. He began repairing what he could of the fences, straightening fallen posts and driving nails until the sun climbed high. The sweat stung his eyes, and his hands blistered beneath the handle of the hammer, yet he felt no resentment for the labor. Every strike, every board lifted back into place seemed to echo something deeper than simple restoration. It was a kind of prayer, his hands speaking where his voice could not. By noon, he paused to rest, sitting beneath the one surviving tree that still cast shade near the well. The dogs joined him, panting quietly, their bodies pressed close as though they had already decided he belonged. One of them, the smaller brown one, placed its head on his knee and looked up at him with eyes that seemed too human in their understanding. He tore off a piece of the bread he had brought from town and offered it. The dog hesitated, sniffed, then took it gently from his hand. It was a moment small enough to be missed by the world, but enormous to him, a gesture of trust, the beginning of something new. When he returned to the barn that afternoon, he noticed how the light changed as it entered through the holes in the roof, turning dust into drifting ribbons of gold. The animals had retreated into cooler corners. The horse stood silently in its stall, the same proud creature that had regarded him yesterday with steady suspicion. He approached it slowly, speaking softly, the way his father had taught him. "Easy, girl," he murmured, not sure why he said it, since he didn't know the horse's sex or name. Still, the sound seemed to calm it. When he reached out his hand, the horse didn't shy away. He brushed its neck with the side of his palm, feeling the roughness of tangled hair beneath his fingers. It was skin over bone, but it was alive and warmth pulsed faintly there. He smiled despite himself. He would feed her, strengthen her, bring back the shine in her coat if it took all summer. The rest of the afternoon he spent gathering anything edible. The overgrown edges of the property yielded patches of wild grass and scattered weeds that the goats would eat. In the corner of the old garden he found remnants of corn stalks, dry, broken, but with kernels still clinging. He scraped them together, grateful for every bit. He mixed water and the corn remains into a rough mash and laid it out in shallow dishes. The hens descended upon it with a frenzy of pecking, their wings flaring as they fought over crumbs. The pigs came next, grunting and rooting in the mud with enthusiasm. Watching them, he laughed quietly, the sound strange in his own ears. He could not remember the last time he had laughed without bitterness. Evening fell slowly over the ranch, painting the ruins in soft hues of red and gold. The light caught on the broken windows of the farmhouse, on the patches of water near the trough, and on the bodies of the animals settling into rest. Michael leaned against the doorway of the barn, exhausted but peaceful. His hands throbbed, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and his shoulders burned from strain. Yet, for the first time in decades, he felt something like belonging. The animals moved around him without fear now. The cats prowled the edges of the barn, their eyes glinting as they hunted unseen prey. The goats nuzzled at his arm when he passed. Even the dogs had curled near the steps of the porch, their bodies forming a living guard against the night. When darkness deepened, he lit the kerosene lamp again and sat beside it on the porch steps. The light flickered across the yard, catching the reflective eyes of creatures in the gloom. Owls perched on fence posts, frogs by the puddles, moths circling in dizzy patterns. He could hear every sound, every movement, and none of it frightened him. The land was alive, and its pulse matched his own. He realized that this strange chorus of wings, hooves, and breath had replaced the emptiness that once echoed through him. That night, he dreamed. In the dream, he stood in a field of tall grass, the sky wide and cloudless. His father was there, not as he had been at the end, tired and thin, but young, strong, standing with his hands on his hips and the sunlight in his eyes. "You see," the old man said, gesturing to the horizon, "the land doesn't die. It waits. You just have to wait with it." When Michael woke, the words lingered like a scent in the air. The next morning, he rose before dawn. His muscles ached, but he felt eager to move. The animals stirred at the sound of his steps, as though expecting him now. He fetched water again, cleared more debris from the barn, and set about building a makeshift pen near the back for the goats and pigs. It was clumsy work, the boards uneven, the nails crooked, but it held. When he led the animals inside, they explored cautiously, sniffing at the corners, then settled down as if accepting the change. Each day that followed unfolded in much the same rhythm. Labor from sunrise to sunset, small victories measured not in wealth or progress, but in survival. The water from the well ran clearer after days of cleaning. The goats grew calmer. The hens began laying eggs in hidden corners, their pale shells like offerings from the earth itself. The horse allowed him to brush her mane with a handful of straw. Even the cats, eternal skeptics, began to linger near him when he worked, their tails curling lazily as they watched. The work was relentless, and yet the more he did, the less it felt like toil. It became a dialogue between him and the land, a slow exchange of effort and reward. Each nail hammered, each bucket filled, each fence repaired seemed to answer the unspoken question that had haunted him for years, whether he still belonged anywhere. Here, among ruins and creatures forgotten by the world, the answer was yes. Sometimes at dusk, when the air cooled and the sky deepened to purple, he would walk the perimeter of the property. The dogs followed at his heels, their ears flicking at every distant sound. He would stop at the edge of the field and look toward the far hills where thunderclouds sometimes gathered. He could still remember the fury of the storm that had driven his family away all those years ago. It had taken everything from them, their home, their crops, their certainty, but now, standing in the quiet aftermath of a life rebuilt, he felt something he hadn't dared feel since then: faith. Not the kind taught in churches, but the kind born of dirt, sweat, and persistence. The faith that what was broken could grow again, that even the most desolate ground could give life if someone cared enough to stay. When night came, he lay on the floor of the farmhouse, his blanket pulled around him, listening to the sounds of the ranch breathing around him, the steady cluck of hens, the occasional snort of the horse, the gentle patting of dogs as they moved in the dark. All of it formed a lullaby older than language. He thought again of his father's voice, of the lessons buried beneath years of grief and disappointment. The land gives what you give it. No more, no less. As sleep took him, a faint smile crossed his face. He had begun with nothing, just dust, ruin, and a handful of animals that had outlived their owners. But already the land was answering him. It had given him water. It had given him warmth. And perhaps, in time, it would give him something more enduring: peace. The days that followed unfolded in a steady rhythm of labor and quiet companionship. Michael rose before dawn each morning, stepping out into the pale half-light that softened the ruined shapes of the ranch. The animals stirred at his movement, their sounds blending with the faint sigh of wind that moved through the broken fences. The routine had begun to take hold, transforming the desolation into something almost orderly. Each sunrise brought its own set of tasks: mending fences, clearing weeds, fetching water, feeding the growing collection of lives that depended on him. It was not a life of comfort, but it was a life of purpose, and that was something he had thought long lost. The days grew warmer as the season shifted. The sky, once open and forgiving, began to press low and heavy. Clouds formed in the distance and hovered there for hours before breaking apart into harmless drizzle. The heat deepened, thickening the air until even the animals grew restless. The dogs panted under the porch, the goats sought shade beneath the lone surviving tree, and the hens spread their wings to cool themselves. Michael worked slower now, stripping off his shirt as he swung the hammer against wood or turned the soil near the old garden. Sweat soaked through the fabric of his hat and stung his eyes, but he kept going, driven by the stubborn need to reclaim what could still be saved. It was on one such afternoon that he noticed the change in the wind. It came sudden and sharp, carrying the scent of salt and rain, though the sky above remained clear. The horses shifted uneasily in their stalls, ears twitching toward the east. The dogs, too, grew alert, their heads lifting in unison as if they shared one mind. He paused in his work and listened. Far off, beyond the distant hills, thunder rolled like a whisper too deep for words. The sound sent a chill through him. It was not fear exactly, but a recognition, a memory awakening in the body before the mind could name it. He had heard that sound before, long ago, on the night when the world had fallen apart. By evening, the sky had turned strange. The sun set behind a curtain of bruised purple, and the air seemed to pulse with a silent electricity. The wind came and went in fits, making the grass shiver and the barn creak like an old ship at sea. Michael moved quickly, gathering what tools he could and securing them in the shed. He had seen enough storms to know the signs, but still he told himself it would pass. Perhaps it would be no worse than the others that brushed across the plains every year. Yet the animals told a different story. The hens clustered together near the barn door. The goats refused to settle. Even the cats, creatures of defiance, slipped silently into the corners as if seeking refuge from something unseen. When the first drops came, they were large and warm, falling slowly and without rhythm. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth. He looked toward the horizon and saw lightning flicker, faint but steady like the slow blink of a watching eye. The wind shifted again, stronger now, bending the long grass nearly flat. He felt it lift his hat from his head, sending it tumbling across the yard. He left it where it fell. There were more important things to worry about. He moved quickly to the barn, closing what remained of the doors and latching them as best he could. The wood was warped, and one hinge hung useless, but he braced it with a beam. Inside, the air was alive with noise. The goats bleated, the pigs snorted, the hens flapped wildly on their roosts. He spoke to them as he worked, his voice calm though his hands trembled. "It's all right. Easy now. You'll be fine. You've seen worse." But the words were as much for himself as for them. Outside, the wind rose with a long, low howl that seemed to come from every direction at once. Rain began in earnest, drumming against the roof with relentless force. Within minutes it was no longer rain, but sheets of water pouring down in blinding torrents. Michael struggled to drag a heavy tarp over the weakest part of the roof, his fingers slipping on wet ropes. Thunder exploded overhead, shaking the barn to its bones. The horse reared and kicked against its stall, eyes rolling white with panic. He rushed to calm her, pressing his hand to her neck, whispering until her trembling slowed. Her breath came in ragged bursts, hot against his skin. Then came the wind, a wall of it, shrieking through the gaps, tearing at everything not nailed down. The doors buckled under the pressure. The tarp he had just secured ripped free, flapping violently before vanishing into the storm. He fought to keep his footing, the mud sucking at his boots. Water seeped through the roof and began to pool on the floor, mixing with straw and filth. The animals pressed closer together, their noise a rising chorus of fear. He worked without thought, moving from one corner to another, reinforcing the walls with whatever he could find. A fallen beam, a crate, his own body when nothing else would do. The storm grew monstrous, roaring as though it meant to erase the ranch from the earth. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard for one terrible instant. Through the open cracks of the barn, he could see the trees bending almost to breaking, the fences collapsing like matchsticks. Rain and wind merged into one living thing that beat against the walls with savage persistence. Somewhere behind him, a section of the roof gave way, and water cascaded down in a heavy stream. He threw a tarp over the spot, anchoring it with a rusted bucket, his heart hammering. Hours passed in a blur of motion. The world had narrowed to survival, his and the animals'. He barely noticed when his shirt tore or when a splinter gashed his arm. His entire body ached, yet he did not stop. When another loud crack sounded outside, followed by a crash that shook the ground, he knew one of the outbuildings had gone down. He didn't dare look. Instead, he checked the stalls again. The horse stood firm now, quivering but steady. The goats huddled near the wall. The dogs barked at every thunderclap but stayed close to his legs. He realized with something like astonishment that they trusted him completely. The thought filled him with a fierce sense of duty. He could not let them down. At some point in the night, the rain turned colder and the air filled with the scent of mud and ozone. His strength began to fade. He sank to his knees beside the trough, water dripping from his hair and clothes, his breath coming hard. For a moment, he thought he could hear voices in the wind, the ghosts of those who had once lived here, the echo of his father shouting orders during another storm long ago. He shook his head to clear it, forcing himself to stand again. The animals were still counting on him. Toward dawn, the fury began to ebb. The thunder retreated into the distance, rumbling like an old threat unwilling to die. The rain slowed to a steady patter, then to a drizzle. Michael leaned against the doorway, his body trembling with exhaustion. He stepped out into the gray morning, blinking at the sight before him. The yard was unrecognizable. Branches and debris lay everywhere, fences flattened, the roof of the shed torn away. The ground was a sea of mud and scattered leaves, but as he turned toward the barn, he saw movement, shapes emerging through the mist. The hens were already stirring, shaking water from their feathers. The goats bleated softly, testing their legs. The pigs snorted and rooted in the wet straw as though nothing extraordinary had happened. And then, through the fog, he saw the horse. She stood tall in the doorway, drenched and glistening in the pale light, her mane plastered against her neck. When she lifted her head, her eyes caught the first hint of sunrise. She looked at him and exhaled, a deep, steady breath that seemed to carry the entire night with it. He felt his throat tighten. They had all survived. He walked among them, touching each creature as though to confirm its reality. The dogs bounded forward, muddy and wagging their tails, leaping up against him despite his protests. He laughed, an unsteady, breathless sound, and let them. The laughter turned to something softer as he looked around at the devastation. The storm had stripped the land bare again, undoing so much of what he had repaired. But it had not taken the living heart of the place. The animals had endured. They always did. By midday, the sun had returned, its warmth turning the puddles into mirrors that reflected the torn sky. Michael spent the hours that followed gathering debris into piles, salvaging what he could from the wreckage. His muscles ached, his hands raw, but the fatigue felt different now. It was not defeat. It was the exhaustion of having stood his ground and held it. As he worked, the animals followed him, their presence a steady comfort. The hens clucked beside him, pecking at the mud. The dogs carried sticks he didn't need but accepted anyway. The horse watched from a distance, her eyes calm and unwavering. That evening, as the light softened once more, he built a small fire near the porch and sat beside it, the warmth seeping into his bones. The animals settled around him in a wide circle, each finding its place, the dogs closest, the goats beyond them, the pigs near the fence, and the horse standing sentinel under the open sky. The land was quiet again, but not empty. The air smelled of wet soil and smoke, and somewhere a frog began to croak by the pond. He closed his eyes, listening to the slow rhythm of life returning. He thought of how easily the storm could have taken everything, how close it had come to erasing what little he had built. Yet it hadn't. The walls had held, the animals had endured, and he had not turned away. For the first time since coming here, he realized he was no longer a visitor in this place. He was part of it now, bound to it by sweat and storm and survival. The land had tested him, and he had answered. As darkness fell, he looked out across the battered yard and saw the faint glow of firelight reflecting in the puddles. The world shimmered with renewal, raw and imperfect, but alive. He leaned back against the steps, the dogs resting at his feet, and let the peace wash over him. Above, the stars returned one by one, unbothered by the ruin below. Michael smiled faintly, his body heavy with fatigue, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The storm had tried to break him, as it had so many times before, but this time he had remained. And because he had, so had the life that depended on him. The morning after the storm was not like any morning Michael had known before. It was the kind of dawn that came hesitantly, as though the sky itself were ashamed of the chaos it had unleashed the night before. The air was thick and cool, carrying the scent of broken branches and wet earth. Puddles stretched across the yard like small mirrors, reflecting the barn's ragged silhouette and the bruised sky above. Michael stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, a mug of bitter coffee cupped in his rough hands, staring at the aftermath. The world around him seemed at once defeated and reborn. The storm had been merciless. Whole fences were gone, flattened under the weight of the wind. The roof of the shed had been torn away completely, its pieces scattered like fallen leaves across the pasture. Even the old oak tree, which had somehow survived every hurricane before, leaned now at a strange angle, its roots half exposed. But amid the ruin, life persisted. The animals moved cautiously through the wet grass, their bodies gleaming in the damp light. The hens were already scratching for insects. The pigs grunted as they rooted through the mud, and Grace, the horse who had endured every trial beside him, stood proud and alive, her mane tangled but her eyes alert. Michael set his cup aside and began to walk the property. His boots sank into the soft ground, the mud sucking at his heels. Every step revealed more damage. A water trough overturned, a feeding bin split in two, the small goat pen collapsed on one side. Yet he did not curse or despair. The storm had tested him and he had survived it. Now came the work of reclaiming what it had taken. He was no stranger to labor. It had shaped him since childhood, but this was different. This work was not for wages or pride. It was for life itself, for the fragile kingdom that depended on his hands. He began with the fences. Many posts had snapped clean in half, the wire twisted into knots. He gathered what boards he could salvage, using the few tools that still worked. The hammer felt heavier than usual, the nails harder to drive into damp wood, but each strike echoed with purpose. The dogs trailed him, curious and faithful, watching as he straightened each post. The goats hovered nearby, occasionally testing the new sections of fence with a tentative nudge, as though unsure whether the boundaries would hold this time. By midday, the sun had burned away the mist, and the heat returned with its usual ferocity. The land steamed, and Michael's clothes clung to his back. He paused only to drink from the well, the water cool and metallic on his tongue. The taste reminded him of childhood, of the first time he had drawn water with his father's hand guiding his own. The memory came unbidden, a voice gruff but patient, the sound of laughter, the scent of freshly turned soil. Those days were gone, buried with the storm that had taken their home decades ago, yet their lessons remained. The land gave back only to those who stayed. That thought carried him through the long hours of the afternoon. He repaired what he could, clearing debris and stacking the unusable pieces into neat piles to burn later. The animals watched his progress with quiet understanding, their presence both a comfort and a reminder of why he could not falter. When the sun dipped lower, he turned his attention to the barn. The roof had lost several more boards during the storm, and one wall had begun to lean dangerously. He climbed onto the lower beams, prying loose what remained of the splintered planks, replacing them with whatever solid wood he could find. His hands bled from the rough edges, but he ignored the pain. Every nail hammered in place was a declaration that he would not surrender to ruin. As dusk approached, a breeze swept through the fields, soft and cool, carrying with it the hum of insects and the distant croak of frogs near the pond. The world seemed to sigh in relief. The dogs lay stretched out in the fading light, their bellies rising and falling in slow rhythm. The cats emerged one by one from their hiding places, slinking through the grass like shadows returning home. Michael climbed down from the barn roof and stood for a long moment, watching the land breathe again. The storm had nearly erased everything he had built, yet somehow the farm seemed more alive than before. The chaos had stripped away the rot, leaving only what was strong enough to endure. That night, he sat by a small fire outside the farmhouse, his body aching but his mind still alert. The flames danced against the dark, casting shifting shapes across the yard. The animals settled around him as they always did, drawn by the warmth and the faint safety it offered. The pigs lay side by side near the trough, the goats huddled close to the fence, and Grace stood a little apart, her silhouette glowing faintly in the firelight. The dogs dozed beside him, their coats still damp, their loyalty unspoken but absolute. Michael reached for his journal, the one he had found hidden beneath the floorboards weeks ago, his father's handwriting filling the pages. He opened it to the entry he had read most often, the one that felt truest to his own life now. "The earth will always test the hand that works it," his father had written, "but it gives back in kind. The harder the trial, the deeper the roots." He traced the words with his fingers, their ink faded but still legible. The storm had tested him indeed, and though it had left him bruised and weary, he had not broken. In that thought there was a quiet, stubborn hope. Days turned into weeks, and the work never stopped. Repairing, feeding, cleaning, each task flowed into the next until time itself blurred. But in that steady rhythm, Michael found something close to peace. The land responded to his labor. Grass began to grow again, where the soil had been stripped bare. The animals thrived under his care. The hens laid more eggs each morning, the goats grew plump on fresh shoots, and Grace's coat gleamed under the sun. Even the cats multiplied, litters of kittens emerging from hidden corners of the barn. The ranch, once silent and abandoned, now pulsed with life. The people in town began to notice. Word traveled fast in a place where nothing ever changed. At first, they came out of curiosity. Men driving their trucks down the old road just to catch a glimpse of the fool who had bought the storm-broken land. They expected to find a ruin, but what they saw instead left them quiet. The fences stood straight again. The barn, though patched and crooked, no longer looked ready to fall. Animals filled the yard: hens, goats, dogs, cats, even a pair of ducks waddling after each other through the puddles. Some visitors smiled awkwardly, offered a nod, and drove away. Others stayed long enough to speak, their words half mocking, half admiring. "Didn't think anyone bring this place back," one man said, shaking his head. Michael only smiled. He didn't need their approval. The land's response was enough. Still, not all of the visitors were friendly. A few came to sneer openly, reminding him of his past, of debts and failures he had left behind when he bought the ranch. They called him stubborn, foolish, a man chasing ghosts. Michael let them talk. Their words were wind, nothing more. He had learned long ago that the earth doesn't care who laughs, it only listens to the hands that work it. And his hands were speaking every day. One evening, while mending the last section of the corral, he noticed the sky changing again, but this time there was no fear. The clouds gathered softly, carrying a promise rather than a threat. Rain fell through the twilight, light and steady, washing over the fields. The animals turned their faces to the sky, unafraid. Michael stood among them, letting the rain soak his skin, and for the first time since he had returned to this place, he did not think of the past. The land was no longer a memory of what he had lost. It was the proof of what he had found again. As summer deepened, the farm began to flourish. The grass grew thick and green, the soil rich and dark. He planted seeds in the small garden, tomatoes, beans, and corn, and watched them sprout under his care. Each morning, he greeted the animals by name, his voice carrying warmth instead of weariness. Grace would nudge his shoulder with her muzzle, demanding attention before he began his rounds. The pigs followed him expectantly, and the dogs ran ahead, barking at unseen intruders. Even the air felt different, alive with the hum of life returning. One afternoon, as he worked in the field, he caught sight of movement at the edge of the property. A young boy from town stood there, watching shyly, a basket in his hands. Michael waved him closer, and after a moment's hesitation, the boy approached. Inside the basket was a bundle of bread and fruit. "Mama said you could use this," the boy mumbled, not meeting his eyes. Michael smiled, accepted the gift, and thanked him. When the boy left, he stood for a long time looking after him, the simple kindness stirring something deep within. The world was beginning to see him not as a fool, but as a man who had chosen to believe in what others had abandoned. That night, he wrote again in his father's journal, this time in his own rough hand. "The land gives only to those who give everything back," he wrote, echoing the words he had once read. "And when it does, it gives more than soil. It gives a reason to live." He set the book aside and listened to the sounds outside. The farm breathed around him, alive and whole. The storm had torn the world apart once, but from its wreckage something new had grown, something stronger, humbler, and truer than before. And as Michael lay down to rest, surrounded by the soft rustle of animals and the whisper of wind through the grass, he knew that his journey was no longer one of redemption. It was one of belonging. The burden of work had become the breath of hope, and the land that had once been broken now beat in time with his own heart. The wind that came with autumn carried a softness that Michael had not felt in years. It swept through the tall grass, whispering across the hills and rustling through the orchard where new shoots had begun to rise from soil once hardened by drought. The heat of summer had faded, and with it the heavy air of struggle. In its place was a crisp clarity that made every color sharper, every sound more alive. The fields gleamed with the sheen of recovery. The barn stood upright, its patched boards sturdy despite their mismatched tones. The farmhouse, though still weathered, had taken on a kind of humble dignity again, the windows covered, the roof mended, the porch swept clean each morning before sunrise. Michael stood at the edge of the property, leaning on a shovel, his eyes scanning the land he had reclaimed. It had taken months of back-breaking work, of sweat, exhaustion, and moments of despair that would have broken a weaker man. But now, looking across the fields, he saw the reward of endurance. The fences held. The soil had turned fertile once more, rich and dark beneath his boots. Animals grazed in every corner, sheep chewing steadily, goats climbing the rocks by the fence line, hens scattering across the yard in flashes of white and brown. The pigs wallowed in their favorite patch of mud, their contented grunts blending with the low hum of bees that lingered near the flowering bushes. Grace stood near the corral, her coat gleaming in the slanted light, her breath steaming faintly in the chill air. It was a scene that no one in town would have believed possible a year ago. He thought of those first weeks when the townspeople had come to watch him struggle. Their laughter still echoed faintly in his memory, but it no longer cut him. He remembered the way they'd leaned from their trucks, mocking the sight of a middle-aged man rebuilding a ghost. Yet no one came to laugh now. Those who passed the ranch these days slowed their vehicles, not to jeer, but to look in quiet wonder. Word had spread, how the broken land on the edge of nowhere had been brought back to life by a man no one had expected to endure. Some came just to see it with their own eyes. Others brought small gifts, feed, tools, even books on crop rotation and livestock care. A few offered apologies without words, leaving sacks of grain at his gate and driving away before he could thank them. Michael accepted it all with calm humility. He did not seek praise, only progress. Each act of kindness reminded him that the land's resurrection was not just his own story. It was something larger, something that drew people back to the idea that what is lost can still be saved. In the following weeks, the ranch became a quiet meeting place for more than just animals. A farmer from the next county came by to ask his advice on restoring a failing pasture. An old widow from town arrived with her sick goat, hoping he could nurse it back to health. Even children came, their laughter filling the air as they ran among the animals. The dogs, once wild and suspicious, had grown gentle and loyal, bounding alongside them in joyful abandon. The cats lounged in the sun, barely stirring as the children's shadows crossed their fur. It astonished Michael how easily life, both human and animal, had begun to weave itself back into this place. But not every day was light. There were still mornings when exhaustion weighed heavily, when his body ached from endless labor. There were still nights when he awoke from dreams of the old storm, the one that had taken his family's home so many years ago. He could still see flashes of lightning in his sleep, hear the splintering wood and the panicked cries of animals lost to the flood. Yet, each time he woke, gasping in the dark, he would hear the steady breathing of life all around him, the soft huff of Grace in her stall, the faint cluck of hens, the rhythmic hum of crickets beyond the window. Those sounds were his reassurance that the past was gone and that he had built something no storm could erase. One morning, as mist curled low over the fields, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was rare now for visitors to come unannounced, and Michael paused his work to watch it approach. The horses that pulled it were unfamiliar, and the man driving sat tall, wearing a coat that marked him as someone from the county offices. When the wagon finally stopped at the gate, Michael wiped his hands on his trousers and walked forward. The man climbed down and offered a polite nod before handing him an envelope sealed with a wax stamp. Inside was an official document bearing his name and the title of the property. His property. For a long moment, Michael could only stare at it. The paper trembled slightly in his calloused hands. It was not the first time he had seen his name attached to this land. Decades ago it had belonged to his father. But the old deed had been lost when the storm destroyed their lives. Now it was his again, not as inheritance, but as reward. The man explained that the Agricultural Board had reviewed reports of his restoration efforts, that inspectors had verified the land's renewed productivity, and that, as of that day, it would once again be registered as a working ranch under his ownership. When the man left, Michael stood in silence, the document pressed against his chest. He turned slowly to look across the land, the barn, the corral, the animals grazing in the distance, and felt a swell of emotion rise so powerfully it almost took his breath. This was no longer a ruin clinging to memory. It was home, reborn through labor, faith, and sheer defiance. That evening, he lit a small fire beside the porch and brought out his father's old journal. The edges of its pages were frayed now, the leather cover worn soft from years of handling. He opened it to the page that had carried him through his darkest hours. The earth gives only to those who give everything back. His father's handwriting was as steady as ever, a voice reaching through time. He smiled, taking out his pen and adding his own line beneath it. And when it does, it gives more than we deserve. As night deepened, the air filled with the sounds of the living world. Frogs sang near the pond, the wind moved through the tall grass, and the animals settled for sleep. Michael leaned back in his chair, the journal resting on his lap, and let the warmth of the fire wash over him. He thought of his parents, their faces, their hands, the way they had once worked this very soil. He wondered what they would say if they could see it now. Perhaps they would not speak at all, only nod in approval as his father once did after a hard day's labor. In the weeks that followed, the boundaries between the ranch and the wider world began to blur. People came not just to watch, but to help. Young men offered their time to repair the outer fences. Women brought baskets of food, sometimes staying to cook while their children fed the animals. A teacher from the nearby school asked if she could bring her students to see what had become of the abandoned land everyone had written off. Michael agreed, though he said little when they arrived, letting the children's wonder speak for itself. They moved among the animals, laughing and asking questions, their small hands reaching out to touch wool, feathers, and fur. When they left, one girl turned back and waved. "We'll come again," she called, and somehow he knew they would. The ranch was no longer his burden alone. It had become a kind of sanctuary for all who had lost faith in the soil. People brought their broken animals, their worn-out hopes, and found here a reflection of resilience. Even the old sheriff, who had once scoffed at the idea of the ranch being worth saving, stopped by one afternoon with a respectful nod. "You proved us wrong, Henderson," he said quietly, "and I'm glad you did." Michael only smiled and offered him coffee. There was no need for grand words. The proof was all around them, the shimmering fields, the animals that thrived, the laughter of children echoing faintly across the distance. As the year drew to its close, the first frost came. It painted the world in silver, crisp and beautiful. The mornings grew colder, but the animals had grown strong, their coats thick and warm. He prepared for winter carefully, storing grain, insulating the barn, ensuring the troughs would not freeze. Each task carried its own satisfaction. He was no longer fighting against time or ruin. He was working in rhythm with the land, understanding its needs as if it were an old friend speaking a language he had finally relearned. One night, as he stood in the barn checking on the animals, he noticed Grace looking toward the open door. The moon hung low above the fields, bathing everything in a pale light. She took a step forward, then another, and he followed her gaze. Out there, beyond the fence, he saw something move, a wild deer, slender and cautious, watching them both. It did not flee. For a moment, man, horse, and deer stood in quiet communion, creatures of the same earth bound by the same unspoken will to live. Michael felt a calm settle over him. The land had come full circle. What was once wild had welcomed him back, and what was once broken had found its voice again. He returned to the porch and sat until dawn, listening as the night surrendered to morning. The first rays of sunlight brushed the horizon, touching the barn, the fences, the fields, and finally his hands. Hands scarred, worn, but steady. He had come here searching for what he had lost, but he had found something greater. The land was alive, the animals thriving, and the people who once doubted him had found hope in his persistence. The world had returned, not with noise or applause, but with the quiet assurance that life, no matter how battered, will always find its way back to the light. And as Michael watched the sun rise over the farm that now bore his name once more, he knew that every nail driven, every storm endured, every wound healed had led to this moment. The land and he were one now, each scar matched by a root, each hardship repaid by the miracle of growth. The ranch, reborn from ruin, was not just his redemption. It was proof that faith, once planted, could outlive even the fiercest of storms. Winter passed quietly on the ranch, not with the cruel sharpness that had haunted Michael's memories of the old storms, but with a stillness that felt earned. The frost lay over the fields each morning like a fine veil, glittering under the pale sun. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, yet it carried a purity that made every breath seem to cleanse rather than burden. The animals huddled close in the barn, their warmth rising in faint clouds of steam when the doors opened. Inside, the scent of hay, leather, and life filled the air. The sound of hooves shifting on straw, of pigs snuffling in their pens, of hens murmuring softly to one another, it was the music of endurance. Michael had learned to move slowly during the winter, to respect the pace the land demanded. There was no rush in nature when it chose to rest. He repaired, mended, and planned. Every morning, after breaking the thin crust of ice that formed overnight on the troughs, he would walk the fences, his boots crunching against frozen earth. The sky above remained vast and mercilessly open, painted in hues of faded blue and ash gray. But where once that sky had made him feel small and alone, now it felt like a companion, an old friend who had tested him and finally accepted him. The months unfolded in quiet rhythm. When the snow came, it came lightly, enough to turn the ranch into a white expanse that gleamed under the winter sun. The animals weathered it well. Their coats had grown thick and their shelters held strong. The dogs kept watch by the porch, their breath curling into mist as they scanned the horizon. Even the cats, those aloof watchers of the rafters, sought the warmth of the house on colder nights, curling at Michael's feet as he sat by the fire. He often found himself speaking to them, his voice echoing in the stillness of the room. There was peace in that solitude, not the hollow, aching silence of his earlier years, but a full and living one, filled with the quiet pulse of existence. When the spring finally came, it was like the earth itself exhaled. The frost melted from the fields, revealing dark, rich soil ready to be turned once more. Streams that had slept through the cold months began to sing again, their waters running clear through the gullies behind the barn. The first shoots of green appeared along the fence line, tender and bright, trembling in the breeze. The animals felt it too. The hens laid more eggs, the goats leapt in the pastures, the pigs rolled happily in the mud that returned after the thaw. Grace, sleek and strong now, galloped across the open field with a freedom that made Michael stop his work just to watch her. He began planting again. A small garden that had once been nothing but a patch of weeds grew into a thriving stretch of life. He tilled the soil with his hands, dropped seeds carefully into the earth, and watered them with the patience that only years of hardship could teach. He had no illusions of abundance, no expectation of miracle. He simply trusted that the land would give back what he had earned. And it did. Slowly, steadily, the first plants broke through. Rows of green marked the soil, the promise of harvests yet to come. Visitors returned with the warmer weather. Some came from the nearby towns, others from farther off, having heard of the man who had brought a dead ranch back to life. They arrived in trucks, on horseback, even on foot, curious to see what persistence had built. They found not grandeur, but something better, a harmony between man, animal, and earth. Michael welcomed them all. He offered what he had: eggs, milk, sometimes a loaf of bread baked by one of the women who helped from time to time. He asked for nothing in return except that they respect the land, and most did. They walked the fields with quiet reverence, their voices low, as if afraid to disturb the sacred order that had taken root there. It was during this time that the idea of the sanctuary took shape. It began with a single act. A young couple from town brought him a wounded fox they had found by the roadside. Its leg was broken, its fur matted with blood. They said they had nowhere else to take it. Michael took the animal gently from their hands and carried it into the barn. He splinted the leg, cleaned the wounds, and fed it bits of meat until it began to eat on its own. Weeks passed, and the fox grew strong again. When he finally opened the barn door one morning, it limped to the threshold, looked back at him for a heartbeat, then vanished into the tall grass. After that, more animals began to arrive. Some were brought by people, others seemed to find the place on their own. A stray cow, thin and lost, wandered onto the property one evening. Michael found her near the stream, ribs showing through her hide, eyes dull with exhaustion. He led her into the barn, nursed her back to health, and named her Faith. Then came a litter of puppies abandoned at the gate, trembling in the rain, and later a wounded hawk with one wing torn from a trap. The farm had become more than a home. It was now a refuge, a haven for all living things that needed another chance. The townsfolk began to see it that way too. They stopped calling it the Fool's Ranch. They called it Henderson's Haven. The name spread quietly, spoken with a mix of respect and awe. Children came on weekends to help feed the animals. The local school teacher brought her students to learn about caring for the land, about patience and renewal. Even the older men, those who had once mocked him at the tavern, came to lend a hand when a fence needed fixing or hay needed stacking. The land had not just healed itself, it had begun to heal the people who came to it. As the months turned to years, Michael aged along with the ranch, but the wear of time seemed to touch him kindly. His hair had gone gray, his hands grown more gnarled, yet there was strength in him that no one could miss. His movements were slower, yes, but steady, deliberate, guided by purpose rather than haste. He had learned to measure life not by speed or ambition, but by endurance and grace. Each day was a small victory, a morning that began with the crow of the rooster, a night that ended with the contented sounds of creatures sleeping safely. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would sit on the porch and watch the sunset stretch across the fields, painting everything in gold and crimson. Grace would graze near the corral, the dogs sprawled at his feet, and the cats curled lazily on the railing. He often thought then of his parents, of how his father's dream had never truly died, but merely waited for him to return and fulfill it. The old journal still lay on the table beside his chair, its pages filled now not only with his father's words, but with his own. He had continued writing, documenting each season, the floods, the droughts, the births, the recoveries. The story of the ranch had become a tapestry of life, stitched with hardship and hope alike. In the third year after the storm, a harvest came unlike any he had known. The garden flourished, yielding more than he could ever use. Corn rose tall, beans hung heavy on their vines, and tomatoes swelled with color. The air was thick with the scent of ripening fruit and tilled soil. Even the animals seemed to sense the bounty. Their movements were lively, their calls jubilant. Michael gathered the crops carefully, storing what he needed, sharing the rest with those who had once doubted him. When he brought baskets of vegetables into town, people stopped him on the street to shake his hand, their faces warm with respect. That autumn, a celebration was held on the ranch. It was not his idea. The people had organized it themselves. They brought food, music, laughter. Families gathered beneath the wide sky, children ran through the fields, and neighbors who had once been strangers shared stories by the fire. Lanterns hung from the trees, glowing like small suns in the dark. For the first time in decades, the land that had once been silent with loss echoed with joy. Michael moved among them quietly, smiling, his heart too full for words. As the night deepened, he slipped away to stand at the edge of the field. The moon hung low, casting its light over the rows of crops and the silhouettes of the barn and house. Behind him, laughter rose and mingled with the crackle of the fire. Before him stretched the land, his land, alive in every sense of the word. He thought of all that had passed, the storms, the loneliness, the endless toil, the ridicule, the long nights of doubt. And he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that it had all been worth it. The world had returned, yes, but it had returned different, gentler, wiser. The people had remembered what it meant to work the earth and to care for something beyond themselves. And he, a man who once came here only to mend his own broken heart, had become a keeper of life in all its stubborn, miraculous forms. As dawn approached, he walked back toward the house. The fire still glowed faintly, the guests asleep in the field or gone home. The animals stirred softly, sensing his presence. He paused by the gate, resting his hand on the worn wood, and looked out one last time before entering. The land stretched wide and endless, bathed in the first light of morning. It was no longer a place of ruin or memory. It was a living testament to what patience, faith, and devotion could build from nothing. Michael smiled, a quiet peace settling over him. The years had taken much, but they had given more in return. The land had tested him, remade him, and now it belonged not just to him, but to every creature that called it home. The kingdom of forgotten animals had become a kingdom of renewal, and its keeper, once lost to the world, had found his place within it forever. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video right here. Every story will surprise you more than the last. And if you felt something today, share this video with someone who needs to see it.